Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go to Moscow and talk with Ben Aris of BNE.EU. Ben, welcome to the Keiser Report.
Good to hear you, Max.
All right, Ben, a recent headline reads, Russians optimistic for 2015. Despite it all, your despair index concurs that Russians are not as gloomy as the media headlines in the UK suggest. So tell us about this.
Well, the despair index was something we invented. It takes in what's happening in the sort of lower half of the society. I mean, most of the macro numbers talk about the aggregate, you know, the oil money, the rich people. And all we did was a very simple thing. We add together inflation, poverty, and unemployment. And there's an old index called the misery index, which is inflation plus unemployment. And in times of crisis, you know, these numbers, inflation rises, unemployment rises, and everyone's very upset. But it doesn't really capture what's happening in the emerging markets. So we added in poverty. And these numbers are typically, you know, on the order of 4 or 5. In Russia, when it collapsed in 1991, this number went to 2,500. If you imagine that's, you know, unemployment plus inflation plus poverty up into the thousands. And today it's fallen right down into the late 20s, early 30s. And Russia today actually has a despair index which is lower than that of everyone else in the European Union, and until recently was also lower than that of America. And the point here is we've got historically low unemployment. Inflation is a problem and is going up today, but also poverty. Poverty in Russia is below that of America. It's around 11%. In the States, it's been climbing, all these working poor. The situation's changed slightly because of this currency crisis. I mean, inflation's gone shooting up to 10%, but even today, Russia is with lower despair than the rest of the European Union, when you've got countries like Spain with unemployment on 25, youth unemployment of 50%. So life for the average Russian is actually pretty good. And the other polls back that up as well. There was a recent poll here that said that the 75% of Russians are actually fairly satisfied with their life. And that's because everyone's got a job, you know, they've got an apartment, they've got money for cars and phones and holidays. Now their ruble won't buy them quite as much abroad, but compared to what life was like a mere 10 years ago, it's like night and day. You know, they live in a normal country. And in that sense, Russia's emerged already. It's no longer an emerging market. You know, it's on a par with Europe. And again, if you ask the people in the bottom half, bottom third of society, it's actually probably a better deal to live in Russia today than it is to live in, say, Europe or America.
Ben, the way you're describing it is, it reminds me back in 1987 during the stock market crash of '87. It hit the yuppies hard, but everybody else, they didn't seem to care. So it sounds like this recent ruble move is really just hitting the yuppies of Russia, and that's about it.
It's selective, isn't it? I mean, most of Russians live a Russian life, they buy Russian goods, and those prices haven't changed. Where it's going to hit the consumer is the rise of inflation, and particularly rising food. And foreign holidays now are off the card. They're simply unavoidable, and the Russians do like to travel. So it is noticeable. But in the grand scheme of things, it's a little bit more than an inconvenience. I mean, life remains pretty much the same, and it's also starting to encourage some import substitution. For example, we're suddenly starting to get Siberian camembert, which wasn't possible before because it was simply cheaper and easier to import stuff.
Wait a minute, Ben. Whoa, you can't have Siberian camembert. That's an impossibility. There's only one camembert, and it comes from France. And you can't have Siberian camembert. I mean, you've gone too far, Ben. That's absurd. Now, wait, let's move on. Now, Ben, you spent...
No, there's a lady in Siberia.
Yeah?
She's a cheese nut, and she flew to France and bought the mold and brought it back to Siberia, and has been making, you know, Siberian camembert with French cheese molds. It has to be. She imported that much of it, and to all accounts, it tastes exactly like the French version. And before, it was impossible to do because, you know, French camembert with the inflated ruble was cheaper than making it in Russia. But that's no longer the case, and now sort of we're facing these new realities, and people are responding in the normal way that, you know, economics demands, and producing the products themselves.
All right, let me ask you, you recently were in the UK. You spent your holidays in the UK, and you're an observer, of course, of these things. Your views on the perceptions of Russia in the Western media. So here in the UK, the local press has a certain perception of Russia. What are your views on this?
Well, it's almost entirely negative, or rather I should say that the Western press tends to report purely the negative stories. I mean, Russia is still a country in transition, even if I'm saying it's not an emerging market anymore, and it has large problems. However, there's been a lot of progress too. And of course, this crisis, I mean, there was a certain amount of schadenfreude that came with it. Everyone was sort of gleefully saying, oh, look, Russia's collapsed. And while the ruble collapse is painful and expensive, you know, the country still functions. It basically still has masses of money in reserve, and it's going to be able to buy its way out of this fairly easily. But all the positive stories are largely ignored. A good example would be perhaps the demographics. I mean, some of the Western press were writing that Russia has the demographics of a country at war and that the population is shrinking, and that's certainly the perception in the West. And yet the Kremlin put through this health reform, this particularly focusing on healthcare for children. And now not only is the population growing, but Russia has the highest fertility rate of any country in Europe, including all of Western Europe. And there's a story, given the reporting on the demographic problems it had in the 90s, that story has been, I think, almost completely ignored. And so people are picking out the bad stuff, but ignoring the good stuff. And, you know, there are lots of good stories. I mean, as I say, when I came to Russia in '93, there was nothing here at all, no shops, no services, no mobile phones. And today, all of those things exist. But there's still a lot to be done. I mean, Russia is still certainly not a normal country, you know, in terms of Western standards.
All right, let's talk about the kind of the big game here, because obviously you've got Russia is aligning itself with China, and they've got the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and they're creating the Eurasian bloc. It's a huge trading bloc, and the U.S. feels that this is a threat, so they are doing whatever they can to derail this project. But I want your comment on some news that's just breaking this week. And this is that Russia is basically put out the message to Europe that they should not align themselves with the trade pact, the TTP of the U.S., that they should basically do a trade pact with Russia. So Russia's, you know, they're trying to extend their trade zone right into the heart of Europe, right with Germany. Really, this is a remarkable development, I think. What are your thoughts?
Definitely. I mean, the Kremlin has said all along that Europe is its natural partner. And there has been this idea in Russia about creating a greater Europe which unites the markets of Western Europe and Russia. The trouble is the European Union will never accept Russia as a sort of a member of the European Union simply because it's too big. And this is the problem. Russia is the biggest and richest country in Europe. And that creates a problem for the existing setup, because if you let Russia into its institutions, it's going to dominate it simply by its size and its wealth.
Yeah, but Ben,
so
let
you've
me
had
jump
this
in.
clash where they tried to cast Russia off.
Ben, let me jump in. So in other words, I mean, Germany's getting hurt. Germany's getting hurt by these trade sanctions imposed on Russia, because the trade is drying up between Germany and Europe and Russia. There's huge trade going on. So
But that's the irony of the situation, is that Europe actually needs Russia, and yet they're trying to push it away for political reasons. But economic reasons, you know, there's already 300,000 jobs in Germany that are directly dependent on Russian trade. And the same with the Russians. They need trade with Europe. But at the same time, because they're being rejected, they've decided to hitch their wagon to the richer part of the world. The emerging markets last year overtook the developed world to become more wealthy in terms, you know, $37 trillion versus $34 trillion in the developed world. And so Russia's betting, you know, well, if you're going to be nasty to us, we'll just go off and make friends with the Chinese. And that makes total sense. And the Russians now have been translating all their settlement of their trade into yuan and ignoring the dollar. And so this is going to be a big problem for the States. I mean, China was doing no settlement of its trade in yuan in 2008, and last year it was a quarter of its trade is now settled in yuan. And 1 ruble is growing. These two are going to emerge as global currencies to the detriment of the dollar. And Russia's actually sitting pretty. It can go both ways, and it already has good relationships with the Chinese. And yet at the same time, you've got the politics of Europe against Russia, but you've got the businessmen of Europe for Russia, because it's already the second largest consumer market in Europe, and it's growing in double digits, and it will continue to grow. And although there's been very little foreign direct investment in Russia, it remains the most profitable investments of any country that's done that investment in emerging markets. And you tell the businessmen, they're all well aware of this. So you actually have this clash between what the politicians are arguing for and what their own businessmen are asking for. So I think in the end, money's going to win out. I mean, politicians are becoming so corrupted by money and companies that the companies, once there's been some sort of face-saving solution to the current political clash, we're going to go back to making money, and that's what everybody wants.
All right, let's talk about oil, because obviously Russia is tied to oil, the oil industry, oil and gas, and the price of oil has dropped pretty precipitously, either because of a glut that has now been recognized, that, or because just because the global slowdown means that demand for oil has dropped off, the price is down, etc. Now, Russia's always been in this situation where when the price of oil is high, it gets lazy and doesn't diversify. And then when the price of oil is cheap, it decides it can't waste any time diversifying, if you know what I mean here. So is Russia finally...
It's the golden rule of countries that governments, if they don't have to make reforms, they won't. Reforms are painful and unpleasant and upset the status quo. And Russia's been in the situation pretty much for the entire time that Putin's been in charge, with growing oil revenues, and particularly in the middle of the noughties, where there was just this torrent of petrol cash flowing through the government, that they didn't need to do anything because they had plenty of money. And it was a bit of a wasted opportunity. So in that sense, the crash of the oil prices is a good thing for Russia, because now they were moving towards making some of the reforms. Already Putin, a couple of years ago, had told the government that they need to lift themselves up the World Bank ease of doing business, which is basically a set of market reforms that you have to do. And Russia's already gone from 120th to about 80th and will get to the top 20 probably in the next 4 years. But that by itself is not enough. And this slowdown, this squeeze, they're going to have 2 years of negative growth, which is going to be a first for Putin, will force the government to refocus, or at least we hope they will. I mean, it's not a given. But that should actually be a net positive for the country, in so much as they'll focus on some of the economic reforms they needed to do. And they haven't done them before because they didn't need to. So in a way, this is a good thing. And again, the crisis this time round is going to be painful, it's going to be expensive, but it's not a crisis in the sense of the crisis we had in 2008, where lots of things went bust, in 1998, where the top tier of the banking sector was destroyed. Russia can afford this crisis because it has plenty of money in reserve. And also they freed the ruble, which will actually cushion the blows. So
all right,
it's
Ben,
going
we're going to have to cut it off there. We're out of time.
A very sharp one.
Okay, Ben, we're out of time. We're going to have to cut it off there. Thanks for being on the Keiser Report.
Pleasure.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Ben Aris of bne.eu. If you'd like to get in touch, tweet us at Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.